Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's Notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil for yet another engaging conversation.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be taking a look at Joseph Stalin's totalitarian control of the Soviet Union, a period marked by incredible transformation, but also by really immense human cost.
Yeah.
Uh,
To really understand the depth of Stalin's control, we need to first examine his rise to power.
yeah, Stalin's ascent, it wasn't, a sudden coup or anything like that. It was
Yeah.
really a calculated process. That capitalized on the power vacuum that followed Lenin's death in 1924.
Absolutely. The death of Lenin, the
Yeah.
leader of the Bolshevik Revolution and the founder of the Soviet Union, left this void in leadership. And this created a fierce struggle for power among the top members of the Communist Party.
Yeah, and many at the time, saw Leon Trotsky, a prominent figure in the revolution and a gifted orator, as Lenin's natural successor.
Trotsky's charisma and his, revolutionary credentials made him a very popular figure. However, Stalin, who held the seemingly unassuming position of General Secretary of the Communist Party, possessed a very different kind of power.
Right, this position, might have seemed bureaucratic, but it gave Stalin control over the party's internal workings. He managed appointments, he controlled the flow of information, he essentially built a network of loyalists.
Precisely. While Trotsky was out captivating crowds, Stalin was consolidating his power base within the party structure. And this strategic maneuvering proved to be absolutely crucial in that ensuing power struggle.
Yeah, and Stalin's rise was also marked by a very systematic elimination of his rivals. He was a master of political maneuvering, forming and breaking alliances as needed to really isolate and discredit his opponents.
He used a combination of propaganda smear campaigns and ultimately brute force to eliminate those who stood in his path.
Yeah, the assassination of Trotsky in Mexico in 1940, orchestrated by a Soviet agent. I mean, this serves as a chilling example of Stalin's ruthlessness and his reach extending far beyond the borders of the Soviet Union.
Trotsky's assassination eliminated one of Stalin's most formidable opponents and sent a very clear message. No one, regardless of location or stature, was safe from Stalin's wrath.
So having consolidated his power, how did Stalin establish and maintain such absolute control over a vast and diverse nation?
Well, Stalin's totalitarian control was built on a multifaceted system. He employed a combination of propaganda, political repression, and a vast network of secret police, the NKVD, to create this climate of fear and obedience.
Let's start by delving into his use of propaganda. It's almost unfathomable to imagine a world where every newspaper, radio broadcast, and film was controlled by the state, all promoting a singular narrative designed to glorify Stalin.
That's precisely the reality that Stalin created. He recognized the immense power of shaping public perception and meticulously crafted this image of himself as a benevolent, infallible leader.
Yeah, this went beyond mere censorship. The Soviet media became an echo chamber, relentlessly promoting Stalin's achievements, real or fabricated, and demonizing his enemies, both real and imagined.
The constant barrage of propaganda was aimed at creating this alternate reality, where Stalin was the savior of the nation, guiding the Soviet Union towards progress and prosperity.
And education played a really crucial role in this indoctrination. Children from a very young age were taught a history that was rewritten to fit the regime's narrative. They joined youth organizations like the Young Pioneers and the Komsomol, which instilled loyalty to Stalin and encouraged vigilance against perceived enemies.
This created a generation that was conditioned to accept Stalin's version of reality, unquestioningly loyal and ever watchful for any signs of dissent or treachery.
And even art and literature, often seen as bastions of free expression, were not spared from Stalin's control.
Socialist realism, a style of art that glorified the Soviet state and idealized the life of the working class, became the only acceptable form of artistic expression.
Right. Avant-garde movements were denounced as bourgeois decadence, and writers and artists who deviated from the party line faced really severe consequences, ranging from censorship to imprisonment.
Think of writers like Boris Pasternak, whose masterpiece, Dr. Zhivago, was banned in the Soviet Union, and Anna Akhmatova, who faced persecution for her poetry, deemed politically subversive.
These examples really illustrate how Stalin's control extended to every facet of Soviet life, stifling creativity and independent thought.
The message was clear. Art should serve the state, not individual expression, and any deviation from that approved narrative would be met with swift and decisive punishment.
While propaganda served to mold public perception, Stalin relied on a much more brutal tool to eliminate any potential threats to his power: political repression.
This period of state-sponsored terror, known as the Great Purge, targeted anyone perceived as a threat to Stalin's regime regardless of their actual guilt or innocence.
And this purge was arguably triggered by the assassination of Sergei Kirov, a prominent Bolshevik leader in 1934.
Kirov's assassination, while its exact circumstances remain shrouded in mystery, provided Stalin with the pretext to launch this wide-ranging crackdown on his opponents, real or imagined.
And some historians believe that Stalin might have even orchestrated Kirov's assassination himself to eliminate a potential rival and create a climate of fear that would allow him to consolidate his power further.
Regardless of who was ultimately responsible, Kirov's death unleashed this wave of arrests, show trials and executions that would decimate the ranks of the Communist Party and terrorize the entire nation.
Yeah, these show trials, carefully staged and orchestrated by the regime, were a grotesque mockery of justice.
Former Bolshevik leaders, once comrades of Lenin, were forced to confess to fabricated crimes, denouncing themselves and others in exchange for leniency that rarely came.
The aim wasn't simply to eliminate perceived enemies, but to humiliate them, to force them to betray their own beliefs and publicly confess to crimes they did not commit.
These spectacles served to instill fear in the population. If even the highest-ranking members of the party were not safe, then no one was.
And the NKVD, Stalin's secret police force, played a crucial role in carrying out this reign of terror.
The NKVD was a vast network of informants and agents operating throughout the Soviet Union, monitoring citizens' activities, intercepting communications, and ruthlessly suppressing any hint of dissent.
Imagine living under the constant threat of denunciation, knowing that a casual comment, a whispered criticism, or even an overheard conversation could lead to your arrest.
The NKVD created an atmosphere of paranoia and suspicion, turning neighbor against neighbor, friend against friend, and even family member against family member.
The impact of the Great Purge was devastating. Millions were arrested, tortured, executed, or sent to the Gulag, a vast system of forced labor camps.
The purge decimated the ranks of the Communist Party, crippled the Red Army by eliminating experienced officers, and silenced intellectuals and artists who dared to express even the slightest criticism of the regime.
And Operation Order Number 00447, a chillingly bureaucratic document issued in 1937, exemplifies the cold, calculated nature of Stalin's repression.
This order established quotas for the number of people to be arrested and executed in each region of the Soviet Union, turning mass murder into a bureaucratic exercise.
The order categorized individuals into two groups, those to be shot immediately and those to be sent to the Gulag, essentially condemning millions to death or a slow, agonizing demise in forced labor camps.
This document stands as a stark reminder of the horrifying efficiency with which Stalin's regime implemented its policy of terror, reducing human lives to statistics on a page.
The Great Purge was a manifestation of Stalin's paranoia and his unwavering determination to eliminate any perceived threat to his power. It wasn't merely about silencing dissent. It was about creating a society paralyzed by fear, incapable of even contemplating resistance.
The psychological impact of the systematic terror was profound. It permeated every aspect of Soviet life, shaping social interactions, family relationships, and even individual thoughts and beliefs.
Now, shifting our focus to another horrific chapter of Stalin's rule, we turn to the Holodomor, a man-made famine that ravaged Ukraine between 1932 and 1933.
The Holodomor, meaning to kill by starvation in Ukrainian, was a direct consequence of Stalin's brutal policies of forced collectivization.
Collectivization aimed to consolidate individual peasant farms into large state-controlled collective farms, theoretically increasing efficiency in agricultural output.
However, this policy implemented with ruthless force and disregard for the traditional farming practices and the deep connection to the land that Ukrainian peasants held proved to be a catastrophic failure.
The Ukrainian peasantry, fiercely independent and resistant to the forced collectivization, faced brutal repression from the Soviet regime.
Their resistance, rooted in a strong sense of national identity and attachment to their land, was met with violent deportation and ultimately deliberate starvation.
The tragedy of the Holodomor goes beyond failed economic policies. It was a deliberate act of genocide, orchestrated by Stalin to crush Ukrainian resistance and break the spirit of a nation.
The regime imposed unrealistic grain quotas on Ukrainian farms, confiscating virtually all of their harvest, leaving them with nothing to feed themselves.
Villages that failed to meet these impossible quotas were blacklisted, their inhabitants denied access to food, and their movements restricted, effectively trapping them within a famine zone.
The borders of Ukraine were sealed to prevent people from escaping the famine, and international aid was refused, condemning millions to a slow and agonizing death.
Stalin's motives were clear. He saw Ukrainian nationalism as a threat to his power, and the Holodomor became a weapon to break their spirit, to subjugate them through starvation.
Millions perished in this man-made famine, a chilling testament to the depths of Stalin's cruelty and his willingness to use mass starvation as a tool of political control.
The question of whether the Holodomor constitutes genocide is a complex one, fraught with historical and political debate.
However, there's compelling evidence of intent. Stalin's actions meet the criteria of the UN Genocide Convention, and a growing number of scholars support the classification of the Holodomor as a deliberate act of genocide.
It is a dark chapter in human history, a stark reminder of the horrors that can unfold when power is unchecked, and ideology trumps basic human decency.
The Holodomor stands as a chilling reminder of the human cost of totalitarian regimes and the enduring scars they leave on both individuals and nations.
From the deliberate starvation of Ukraine, we turn to another grim manifestation of Stalin's control, the Gulag, a vast network of forced labor camps spread across the Soviet Union.
The Gulag, short for Glavno Upravni Lagery, meaning main camp administration, was a system of penal colonies and forced labor camps that became synonymous with Stalinist repression.
The Gulag system began modestly in the early years of the Soviet Union, but under Stalin, it expanded exponentially, becoming an integral part of his totalitarian regime.
Millions were imprisoned in the Gulag, their offenses ranging from political dissent to petty crimes, or even simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Imagine being swept up in a wave of arrests, accused of crimes you did not commit, and sentenced to years of hard labor in a remote and unforgiving corner of the vast Soviet Empire.
The conditions in the Gulag were brutal. Prisoners faced starvation, disease, overwork, and the constant threat of violence from guards.
They were forced to work in harsh conditions, often in extreme climates, mining coal-felling trees, building roads and canals. Their labor used to fuel the Soviet industrial machine.
The psychological toll of the Gulag was immense. Prisoners were isolated from their families, deprived of their basic human rights, and subjected to constant psychological and physical abuse.
The Gulag was not just a place of punishment. It was a system designed to break the human spirit, to transform individuals into obedient cogs in the machinery of the state.
Millions perished in the Gulag. Their deaths often unrecorded, their stories untold. Their suffering stands as a stark reminder of the dehumanizing nature of totalitarian regimes.
The Gulag's legacy is one of unimaginable suffering, and the enduring trauma it inflicted on generations of Soviet citizens.
It serves as a chilling reminder of the human cost of unchecked power and the fragility of freedom in the face of state-sponsored terror.
Stalin's control extended beyond brute force and physical imprisonment. He also engaged in a systematic effort to reshape the cultural landscape of the Soviet Union, a process known as Russification.
Russification aimed to promote Russian language and culture as dominant within the Soviet Union, often at the expense of other ethnicities and cultures.
It was a multi-pronged strategy, encompassing language policies, educational reforms, and even demographic engineering.
The Russian language was imposed on non-Russian populations, becoming the official language of administration, education, and public life.
Schools became instruments of assimilation, with curricula emphasizing Russian history and culture, often neglecting or even denigrating local traditions and languages.
Imagine a society where your native language, the language spoken by your parents and grandparents, is gradually erased, replaced by the language of the dominant power.
That was the reality faced by countless ethnic minorities under Stalin's rule. Their languages were marginalized, their cultures suppressed, their identities systematically eroded.
Intellectuals, artists, and religious leaders from non-Russian backgrounds were targeted. Their works were censored, their practices banned, their voices silenced.
Traditional customs and celebrations were discouraged or even outlawed, replaced by Soviet-approved holidays and rituals, designed to promote a homogenized Soviet identity.
Entire populations were deported from their homelands and resettled in distant regions, disrupting their communities, their livelihoods, and their cultural continuity.
This demographic engineering aimed to dilute the concentration of ethnic minorities in certain regions and strengthen Russian dominance.
Russification was a brutal assault on cultural diversity, a deliberate attempt to homogenize the Soviet Union under the banner of Russian language and culture.
It left a lasting impact on the former Soviet republics, with many still struggling to revive their suppressed languages and reclaim their cultural heritage.
The legacy of Russification is a complex one, marked by resentment, linguistic, and cultural revival efforts, and ongoing tensions between national identity and the shadow of Soviet dominance.
Stalin's totalitarian control had a profound and enduring impact on Soviet society, shaping its political, economic, and social fabric for generations to come.
His policies led to a really dramatic transformation of the Soviet Union, propelling it from an agrarian society to an industrial powerhouse, but at an immense human cost.
Stalin's forced industrialization, fueled in part by the slave labor of the Gulag, resulted in rapid economic growth but also created widespread hardship and scarcity.
The emphasis on heavy industry and military production came at the expense of consumer goods, leaving the majority of the population struggling to meet their basic needs.
Despite the regime's propaganda touting, economic progress, the reality for most Soviet citizens was one of long lines, rationing, and constant shortages.
The psychological impact of Stalin's rule was perhaps even more profound than its economic consequences.
Yeah, the constant fear of denunciation, the suppression of dissent, the pervasive atmosphere of suspicion created a society that was traumatized and deeply distrustful.
This trauma extended far beyond the immediate victims of Stalin's repression. It permeated families, communities, and even seeped into subsequent generations.
Children grew up in households where silence was the norm, where expressing one's true thoughts and feelings could have really dire consequences.
This created a legacy of fierce self-censorship and a reluctance to engage in open and honest dialogue that persisted long after Stalin's death.
And the impact of Stalin's rule can be seen in the literature, art, and music produced in the decades following his death, often reflecting these themes of alienation, disillusionment, and the struggle to come to terms with a traumatic past.
To fully grasp the magnitude of Stalin's impact, I think it's helpful to compare his regime to other totalitarian regimes in history, such as Nazi Germany and Maoist China.
While each of these regimes was unique in its ideology and methods, they shared certain chilling similarities: a centralized control of power, suppression of dissent, and the use of propaganda and terror to maintain control.
Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler stands out for its ideology of racial purity and its systematic genocide of European Jews, the Holocaust, a crime of unprecedented scale and horror.
While Stalin's regime was responsible for the deaths of millions, the Holocaust's specific targeting of Jews based on race sets it apart as a uniquely horrific chapter in human history.
However, both Nazi Germany and Stalin's Soviet Union utilized similar methods of control, including secret police forces, propaganda machines, and concentration camps, albeit with different targets and motivations.
Maoist China, under the leadership of Mao Zedong, also bears some striking resemblances to Stalin's regime.
Both regimes implemented radical social and economic transformations, including forced collectivization of agriculture and rapid industrialization, often with disastrous consequences.
Mao's Great Leap Forward, aimed at rapidly transforming China into a socialist utopia, resulted in a catastrophic famine that claimed the lives of tens of millions.
The Cultural Revolution, another hallmark of Mao's rule, unleashed this wave of violence and persecution against intellectuals, artists, and anyone perceived as a threat to Mao's ideology.
While these specific ideological underpinnings may have differed, the methods and consequences of totalitarian control were strikingly similar in both the Soviet Union and China.
The comparison highlights the inherent dangers of unchecked power, regardless of the specific ideology that motivates it.
Historians continue to debate the motivations behind Stalin's actions, the effectiveness of his policies, and the best way to understand his legacy.
The traditional totalitarian model emphasizes the repressive nature of his regime, focusing on the use of terror, the cult of personality, and the suppression of individual freedoms.
This view tends to portray Stalin as an all-powerful dictator, ruthlessly crushing any opposition, and shaping Soviet society according to his will.
Revisionist historians have challenged this kind of monolithic view, arguing that it oversimplifies the complexities of Soviet society.
They suggest that people weren't simply passive victims, but found ways to navigate and even manipulate the system for their own benefit.
They point to examples of resistance adaptation, and even instances of individuals thriving within the constraints of the system.
Post-revisionist historians have sought to integrate these different perspectives, acknowledging the brutality of the regime, while also exploring the nuances of social life and the ways in which people responded to and shaped the system.
This approach recognizes that Stalin's rule was not a static monolith, but rather a dynamic and evolving system, shaped by both top-down control and bottom-up responses.
The ongoing historiographical debate highlights the importance of critically examining historical events, challenging established narratives, and seeking a more nuanced and comprehensive understanding of the past.
Stalin's legacy continues to be debated and contested, both within Russia and internationally, serving as a reminder of the enduring impact of totalitarian regimes and the importance of safeguarding individual rights and freedoms.
As we conclude our deep dive into Stalin's totalitarian control, it's essential to reflect on the lessons we can draw from this dark chapter in human history.
Stalin's rule stands as a stark warning about the dangers of unchecked power, the seductive allure of ideology, and the fragility of human rights in the face of totalitarian ambition.
It reminds us that the fight for freedom, for individual dignity, and for a just society is a constant struggle, one that requires vigilance, critical thinking, and a commitment to democratic principles.
Understanding the mechanisms of oppression, recognizing the warning signs of authoritarianism, and actively engaging in the defense of human rights are crucial steps in preventing the rise of tyranny.
Thank you for joining us on this journey through a complex and often disturbing period in history. We hope this deep dive has provided you with insights and perspectives that will stay with you long after this episode ends.
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.